All right, so in this chapter, we're talking about inflation calculations mainly. So in the previous chapter, we talked about calculating inflation using the GDP deflator approach. Now we're going to use what's more commonly used to refer to inflation and what we're interested in when we're going to be asking for wage increases at a different job. So we're going to be talking about consumer price index inflation. So inflation is generally the term used to talk about the overall increase in the price level, and the inflation rate is the percentage change in the price level from the previous period. So how does the consumer price index inflation work? Well, the consumer price index looks at the overall cost of the goods and services purchased by the average consumer. So here what we mean by the average consumer is we're not going to be eating caviar or other things like that just because the average consumer does not consume this on a monthly basis. So you'd be thinking more along the lines of like bread, orange juice, clothing, and other things like that. So Statistics Canada calculates the CPI each month using roughly 600 items. And when the CPI rises, that means that the typical family has to spend more dollars to maintain the same standard of living because that basket of goods, which we'll see in a second, rises. So what are those 600 items more or less? Well, about a quarter of it relates to shelter, household furnishing 13%, food 16%, and then the rest have different percentages out there. So obviously some people, such as BU students, probably have a higher percentage than 2.9% of their spending goes towards alcoholic and tobacco products, but this is just representing the average consumer. So what will be the actual steps in this class? It's a simplified version of what's going on in the reality. First off, the question that you may see will have a certain basket. So a basket will be given to you. You're going to have so much X, so much Y, and so on and so forth. So what and how much of each good to be included? So examples could be 4 liters of milk, 2 kilograms of pasta, 6 oranges, and so on and so forth. You need to find the prices for all the items for each year or month or whatever that you're interested in. So you know the basket, you find the prices, and with that, you can calculate the cost of the basket. So what's going to be the cost of this basket in 2000? What's going to be the cost of the basket in 2001? And 2025, and so on and so forth. So you have this basket that you see its cost evolve over the years. So essentially, you're trying to compare the price of that basket. So you're really comparing the same basket in this case. And that's pretty much it. Calculate CPI by comparing costs of those baskets over the different years. So how do we compare it? Well, let's say that we had a basket that cost $800 and then 4 years later, so we're going to calculate inflation on a 4-year period, is $1,400. You can look at this, but it's not necessary. It's like for the GDP deflator, this kind of intermediate process is good to calculating CPI or GDP deflator, and then through a second step you could calculate the inflation, but I'm really just interested in this inflation using the CPI approach. So it's putting the new year, the newest year, over the base year that you're interested in, minus 1 times 100. So the same kind of process as with the GDP deflator. And naturally, if prices have risen, well, that basket is now more expensive than it used to be, so this number is going to be greater than 1, leading to a certain percentage, which will be reflecting inflation for that 4-year time period. I prefer to bypass that calculation here just because it's easy to get confused and to make mistakes. So simply just use this bypassing tool. If you do the 2-step approach, you'll still get the same answer, and that's also fine, but it's just a little bit longer. So if we take this example here, we may want to calculate the basket of the basket, how much it costs in both periods. So the thing is, when we talk about consumer price index, is that the basket is fixed throughout all these years. Whereas the GDP deflator approach really looks at what's being produced in a given year, but that production can change. In the simple 2-year models, it may seem similar, but there's some differences going on here. So we have to calculate the value of this basket in year 1. Why don't we just do 10 plus 1 plus 10 plus 2 plus 5, 17, and then 15 plus 3 plus 6, 24 over 17 to get our inflation? Well, if you do simply adding up all these three numbers, you're essentially assuming that you're spending a third of your income on each of them. You're spending equal weights. But in reality, the weights are different. We could see here that Z accounts for a greater amount of our basket than X and Y. Therefore, if we look at these, X had 50% inflation, Y had 50% inflation, but Z only had 20% inflation. So here, compared to the example that we had with the GDP deflator, we have a really high weight associated to the good that suffers very little inflation. So it's still within that 20 to 50% range, because we know that these two goods have a 50% inflation and the third good has 20% inflation. But because there's a higher weight on that third good, we're going to be closer to that 20% this time than last time. So let's just go through this quickly. So 10 times 10, 2 times 15, and 5 times 40. So here we have 100, 30, and 200. So our basket initially costs $330. And then here we have same numbers here. So make sure that you always have something that's common between the two so the quantities are common. 150, 45, and then 240. So over here we'll have 390, 435 if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that looks about right. So here I'd have 435 over 330 minus 1 times 100 will give me my inflation using the CPI approach. So let's see, the next slides have the answers. So 435 over 330 minus 1, well, we get 31.8% inflation. So closer to that 20%, but still not quite at it, because we had a good proportion of our consumption still came from X and Y. Maybe like a third of it came from those products. So essentially this is what's going on. This is how we would calculate inflation using the CPI approach. So what are some of the potential difficulties with using the CPI approach, even though it's commonly used? Well, one of the big ones is this idea of substitution bias. So if I think of substitution bias, the big problem with the CPI approach is that we're forcing people, the average consumer, to buy the same basket over all of these years. But we can't really take into account things that may have happened in a given year which would have led you to substitute consumption of that good. Give you an example. Many years ago I was in Australia, and when I was there, bananas were really expensive, so I just stopped buying bananas. I later realized that it was because there was this big drought that happened, so prices of bananas went up by like 5 or 10 times. So they were really expensive that I just simply bought other fruit. And it would have been the same if I was here. If bananas are now like, I don't know, $20 for a pack of bananas, I'll probably just buy something else. Well, the problem with the CPI method is it will say, well, from this year to this year, this is what the typical consumer buys in bananas. But it doesn't take into account that that year that bananas are really expensive, that he's going to substitute away and buy another fruit instead. So that's the first big problem that happens with CPI. Another problem that happens with CPI is the introduction of new goods. As new goods are being introduced, they might not have been part of that initial basket. Also, some of these goods may change in quality over time, which makes it a little bit harder to compare. Taken together, these sources of bias cause the CPI to overstate the cost of living by 0.5 percentage points per year, according to the Bank of Canada. You don't have to worry too much about this, but just keep it in mind if ever you listen to CPI and you know that a few things have skyrocketed in prices. you might want to keep that in mind. We're going to talk about core inflation in the future, which is essentially CPI, removing the very volatile components. So some of those will be removed anyways in core inflation. So next up, we're going to look at the CPI versus the GDP deflator, and to analyze both of them as methods to calculating inflation.